Welcome to Zero Knowledge, a podcast where we explore the latest in blockchain technology and the decentralized web. The show is hosted by me, Anna.
And me, Frederick. Today we sit down with Dominic Tarr to talk about P2p networking and secure Scuttlebutt.
So today we're sitting with Dominic Tarr, who's a security auditor at Least Authority and also a protocol designer. He works on Scuttlebutt, which is a secure gossip protocol. So welcome to the show, Dominic.
Hi, Anna.
We're also here with Frederick.
Hello.
So we've started to ask guests who come to the show a little bit about why they're working on what they're working on. So I'm going to throw that your way. Why do you work on what you work on?
Well, once upon a time, this is something like about 10 years ago, I was living in the forest. I was living in a hammock, being a hippie basically. And after a year of that, I decided this was too easy. I needed to do something challenging. And I had two ideas. And one was to build a boat and sail it to Southeast Asia and then see how that went. And the other idea was to do this computer stuff. And I had some vague ideas and of something I could build. And I decided that by the time I was 35, now I'm 36, if I did the boat thing, I'd look back and I'd wonder if those computer ideas would have worked. But the other way around, I was I could definitely still go sailing if I wanted to. And the computer thing was obviously harder. So I decided to do that.
How old were you when that happened?
25 or 26 or something like that.
So we want to sit down and talk today about P2p networking. It's something that we've talked a lot about on this show before, but in passing almost. It's an assumption that we have that people just know what peer-to-peer networking is and how it works. And I don't think that's necessarily true. So I want to explain some of the basics, but I also want to dig into some of the tricky topics of this area. And you have obviously some peer-to-peer networking background with Scuttlebutt. So maybe just as a brief starter, what is Scuttlebutt? What is Scuttlebot? And, what are these different projects and sort of how do they do networking?
Well, Scuttlebutt is the protocol. Scuttlebot it's just named, that's the server that runs the protocol. So it's just that isn't really the name of the project. That's just a name of one particular Git repo that is called that for a historical accident. So don't worry about Scuttlebutt. Scuttlebutt is the important thing.
But I think for developers, it's still if you want to learn, a lot of people learn a protocol by reading through the code.
Yeah.
So if you want to do that, Scuttlebutt is the right place to look, or is there a better place to look?
It's now called SSB-server.
All right.
But we have a lot of code. It's all on the GitHub/SSBC. That stands for Secure Scuttlebutt Consortium.
Going back to that, though, where does Scuttlebutt come from? Where does it start?
Yeah, so Scuttlebutt is a nautical term for gossip. Scuttle means open or opened, and butt is a barrel. So it's the opened barrel of today's drinking water. So it's like a water cooler, but on a pirate ship.
And then what is the history of the Scuttlebutt protocol?
Well, I actually got the term from the word scuttlebutt from an Amazon paper. This is sort of what led me to working on peer-to-peer stuff. So I read this paper called DynamoDB, which is a system Amazon built to build the shopping cart and stuff like that. DynamoDB is it's a peer-to-peer protocol inside of their data center. So the architecture is quite analogous to how BitTorrent works. They have a cluster of nodes that are part of the network, and they all gossip with each other about just to keep track of the information of what are the nodes and what are their IP addresses that are in the network. And then each node takes responsibility for part of the data set. It's pretty much exactly like a DHT. Yeah, I would highly recommend listeners to read the Dynamo paper. It's very clearly written and covers a whole range of concepts.
So that was that was a paper that you stumbled upon. We'll add that to the show notes.
No, it was recommended to me.
Oh, it was recommended to you. And then what happened from there?
So basically, Scuttlebutt, the protocol in Amazon, was just like I implemented a thing based on ideas like that, and then I like messed around with a whole bunch of other stuff. I got to the point where I had learned enough about data replication and databases and a bit of cryptography and stuff that I wanted to build some kind of generic application platform, like just sort of some sort of system that you could build wide range of applications on top of that were all decentralized. And I was originally thinking like of a target use case, sort of more like Wikipedia, because, you know, Wikipedia feels like it's really like one of the most positive things on the internet. I was trying to explore ways of doing like generic replication, and I sort of came to the conclusion that it was you could much more efficiently replicate like structured data than just arbitrary data. And the simplest structure I knew was an append-only log. One day I realized that that social networks basically mapped to this, and people like using social networks, even they probably like it too much. But that gives you like a story about like, this is how you could build this, it will grow because people are addicted to using this kind of thing. You know, like the whole decade before blockchain became a thing, like every application was just a social media application. So you could build all of them using this approach.
So you scrapped the Wikipedia idea.
I was just like put that back in the pile. I'll just focus on like the simpler thing that still does 85%.
Interesting. So like you actually had a use case right off the bat, like, or did the use case come later?
Well, no, it was like the breakthrough was realizing that you could build a social media thing on it. Because one of the things I was thinking is like, if you have this decentralized system, you need some way of discovering the stuff that's on it.
I want to get back to Scuttlebutt a little bit later and dig into some more specifics there. But let's take a step back and look a little bit at networking and explain some concepts. So you've already mentioned some of these things. Let's start at a DHT. What is a DHT?
What does it stand for?
DHT stands for distributed hash table. A DHT works by, you get all the nodes in a network, form into a circle, and then content of the network is distributed around the circle evenly. So if you keep track of a couple of nodes randomly scattered around the circle, when you want to look for something, you go and ask the node that's nearest piece of content you're looking for, and then they tell you, either they give it to you if they have it, or they know about a node that's nearer to it, so they tell you about that node and say, go ask that guy.
And this has been around for a long time. This is back when like you were doing kind of peer-to-peer downloading. This would have been used at that time, I guess.
I'm not sure exactly. So, disclaimer, I am a DHT skeptic.
Oh.
But I think they sort of came around in like around 2000s.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of problems which I'd be happy with DHTs that I'd be happy to explain. But I think it's like BitTorrent came out, which was like 2005 or something, if I recall. Didn't use DHTs at the start, but got DHTs a little while. There was something called Cord, I think was the first one. That would have been early 2000s. And then Kademlia was the improvement on that, which is now sort of the
Do you know if
gold standard.
Nutella used it?
I believe Nutella didn't have a DHT.
Okay. So it's sort of pre-DHT.
So you mentioned Kademlia there, or Kademlia, depending on... I've never heard what the correct pronunciation is. I always say Kademlia myself, but it might be Kademlia.
I have no idea.
But Kademlia, I would associate with a discovery protocol. And DHTs and discovery is very tightly linked, but they're not necessarily the same. Like you can use a discovery protocol just to find one peer and ping it and do something if you want to do that. Yeah. But obviously they're kind of usually used to build the DHT over time.
You could use a DHT for discovery, but you could use it for other things as well.
So how would you explain a discovery protocol? What's the purpose?
Well, in this case, we're just looking for, you mean discovery is to find other peers, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in each system, there's usually a peer is like, let's start by defining what a peer is.
That's a good start.
In a peer-to-peer protocol, basically you've got a system, there's a bunch of computers in it. And the thing that makes the difference between a peer-to-peer protocol and a server-client protocol is that in the server-client protocol, there's like a specialized role and one computer has it, and that's the server. And then the other one's the clients, like connect to that. And then the server does some one important thing, and the clients do some other less important thing or something like this. In a peer-to-peer system, all the clients are roughly equal. They more or less have the same capabilities and can replace each other.
So there's no central hub. It's not like, what is it called? Hub and spoke, I think is the term, right? When there's like a hub and then the client and server.
Sure.
The server is the hub and the clients are the spokes. In this case, it's more like a mesh.
Yes. Well, there's different shapes that a network can be in.
Okay.
For example, you can have there's a ring-shaped network, like a DHT. You could have like a lattice or like grid-shaped networks. So one example of a lattice-shaped network is actually cell phone towers are arranged in a hexagonal lattice.
Oh, wow.
They have like directed, like, the antennas like shoot some frequencies that way. Okay, I'm gesturing in like a triangular shape. And then they're arranged so they don't overlap, so they don't collide with each other. And hexagonal lattice means that circular radiations of radio waves have minimal overlap. It doesn't really make sense to have like a lattice sort of network when it's just like computer connections over TCP. But another really good structure is actually just randomness. Like if peers are just connected randomly to each other, this is like actually really good design because peers don't need to be clever, first of all. It's just like really easy to just connect randomly. If you have a design that works with random properties, then it's probably gonna work. Like you don't really need to. It's just easy to ensure that works. And if nodes like drop out and crash and that sort of stuff, it'll still work. Very, very resilient.
So, but in that scenario, like if I'm just connected to random peers and I want to send a message to Anna, not to a random person, how do I find her? Like, how does my message make it there?
Well, you're assuming that you want to build some kind of routing thing. So there's various ways that people have designed systems to do this kind of thing. Yeah, I have avoided routing designs because I don't think they're the best basis for the first layer, because you would need to basically, you can't route directly to so if you knew that route Anna was online right now and you knew how to contact her, you could just make a connection, except then there's other things that throw spanners in the works, like there aren't enough IP addresses left. So there's a shortage of, there's only 4 billion IP addresses and there's more devices than that now. And it basically means that, like, imagine if there weren't enough telephone numbers and some people had the same telephone number, it would mean that you can't really call those people reliably. So imagine a world where there were two types of telephones, more expensive telephones that could receive phone calls, and then cheap telephones that couldn't receive calls but could dial calls. And so businesses would buy the ones that could receive calls, and regular people would buy the ones that couldn't receive calls. And this is the situation with the internet. You can't really call your friends except by calling a service for like introducing your friends. That could be fixed with IPv6. However, it's still been like 20 years and we're still waiting for IPv6 to be fully rolled out. So I'm just assuming that's not going to happen.
But let's go back to this idea, because I think you sort of said send something to me, and I think we went in the path of routing.
Yeah.
I'm actually curious, or like I want to dig into two aspects of that question. One is the discovery part, and what are we trying to discover in a discovery protocol? Are we trying to discover random peers or anyone at all to connect to, or are we trying to discover any specific peer?
Well, I mean, I'm trying to answer why it's so hard, why there isn't just a simple answer, because if there was, it would exist, because that's what everyone wants.
Yeah. But the other thing, and you mentioned this already as well, and we've explained this briefly on the show before, which is gossiping. Mm-hmm. So the dumb answer kind of how I get my message to Anna is I send it to everyone,
yes,
and they send it to everyone,
yep,
and then hopefully it gets there.
Oh, that would definitely work. There's a very high chance that will work.
But then there'd be a lot of gossip out there.
Yes.
And I just have to go through all the gossip to find out what is actually sent to me.
Yeah. If there's some sort of ways of like limiting how far things spread, this would totally work. Very simple and very resilient. There are protocols that are for routing, but because of this shortage of phone numbers, you need to have a server to introduce you. So making a fully peer-to-peer connection nowadays is more like being set up on a date than just calling someone. Like, you need a third party involved.
Okay. So then is it still really peer-to-peer?
Well, it depends on how central that third party is.
In many cases, that third party is just your router. So, like, I can connect directly to your router, but that assumes that your ISP isn't, like, interfering at some point, where in many countries, the ISP controls the IP, and then you're getting some subnets of that.
Or there can be multiple layers of NAT before you get to your thing. So it can be more difficult or less difficult. It depends. If you're at the same if you're on the same Wi-Fi, you can just connect directly because you can just see each other's IP addresses basically.
But going back to what you just said, it was sort of like if there's a third party, it sort of depends on how kind of decentralized you need it to be, because that third party could be one of 10 or one of 100 or one of 1,000, or it's like a peer as well who has a different role.
Well, I think it just depends on who has the power to run those third parties and what their motivation is. So, for example, if your application has one of these introducers that the developers of it run, that's not very decentralized. But if anyone who's enthusiastic about the protocol can run one of these introducers, then I'd say that is decentralized. It's just you have some nodes that do a little bit more. Some protocols have a thing called a super node, where you have special nodes that do extra stuff. It just, it's a spectrum. It makes it a little bit less centralized, but it's not a deal breaker, I think.
And when you're speaking about routing, there's an additional problem other than NATs, which is routing in itself is an NP-hard problem. Just finding a path to someone is like the traveling salesman problem. How do you find the shortest path from where you are to where you want to go through a set of other nodes?
When it's not mapped for you before.
Even if you have the map, it's
why is it so hard?
Well, that's finding the optimal path.
Yeah.
Finding like an adequate path is not necessarily.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, exactly. And what is an adequate path? And all of these issues are pretty tricky to deal with, and like figuring out the correct parameters. And like this is something that like Lightning Network has been struggling with a lot of, like, how do I find where I'm sending my money? And they have to do routing because the other person, the receiver, actually has to sign off on something and send it back. So they're kind of going with this hub and spoke model, just assuming there will be some kind of centralized entity that it doesn't have any power other than the ability to censor you, but that's still quite a lot of power. And then you have like supernode structures where there's like maybe 10 supernodes and not just one, and then you can kind of gradually build up other maps. But yeah.
So I think the smart thing to do here isn't try to squeeze a routing protocol out of a stone, but just to avoid the hard problems. Just like accept that there are some things that there is an easy solution to. Try to design systems that just avoid that. So, for example, one problem that you haven't mentioned yet, but is one of the things that is like the blocker that enables a bunch of stuff, is how do you map a public key to a peer? This is the thing. It's like if you know what public key represents a particular person, then you can establish a secure communication with them. But if you don't know, then you really have no idea if you're talking to the right person. So an encrypted channel is kind of meaningless unless you know that this is the key you're meant to be using. This is one of the problems that's like, once we solve this, it will suddenly become easy to do things like routing.
I mean, in that what you just described, then it's also like identity, right? It's like matching identity to some number.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, there's lots of projects that are working on that, but what's the real challenge of that? Like, is it just because there's kind of no way to do without like some centralized database?
No, I disagree. I think so I have my own horse in this race.
Okay.
So I think the challenge is really just make a system that people use, and that people, use it in a way they're like, that they don't really think about it. They're just like, I'm talking to this person. That's who I want to talk to.
But how do you make it? Like, the question there is like, how do you? You just sort of said this is like the big problem that still hasn't been solved.
Yeah. So So once upon a time, there was this thing called PGP, pretty good privacy. And it used this idea called the web of trust. So this was like back in the early 90s. It was a big deal back then. Now everyone pretty much agrees, including its creator, that it's like horribly unusable. And you would go to people actually did this. They'd go to these key signing parties where they'd go and then they would check each other and be like, yes, you are really this key. And then they would sign each other's keys. And then that would go on a record that this person acknowledged that person. And then you could be like, if you trusted this person, well, they said these people were things. So you could kind of figure out who was mapped to who. It was like very decentralized. And
very time intensive.
Yeah. And I've been led to believe that some of the key signing parties were attached to actual parties and some may not have been. I'm not really sure. I've never been to a key signing party.
Sounds like this is one step away from like wizard hats. And
Oh, yeah, I think so.
maybe not one step away at all.
But anyway, it doesn't, to me, I like that idea seemed like it was basically sound, but it didn't really sound very fun to me. And when I came to this space, it was already like post Web 2.0. And so Web 2.0 figured out a whole bunch, like a playbook basically of how you get people to use your application. And the first thing really is you make it fun and you don't ask people to think about it. You just like give people buttons to click on and get the feedback from other users and stuff like this. You go for like viral growth and that sort of stuff. But the thing with Web 2.0 is you can interpret social networks and stuff created by Web 2.0, you can interpret them as a web of trust. The users don't explicitly think about it when they're using it, but if you follow 300 people on Twitter and then there's like 300 million people that you don't follow, so you have said very explicitly, like, these are the people I trust, all those other people, I'm not saying anything about them. Maybe I explicitly distrust them, but it's like, you will definitely say, I'm willing to receive whatever these people post. You can interpret this as a web of trust. And interestingly, it's more about lots of small interactions than one big key signature thing. So you can also look at the sort of thing as like, you know, we spend a lot of time nowadays interacting with entities, with other things that are sending us messages over the internet. Like, I got invited to this podcast by email from people I'd never met. I read the email and then decided, oh, this is a real human.
We were introduced.
Yeah, we were introduced. Exactly. So that's a web of trust. It was easy because I knew that Liz wasn't just in a long con where it's like, now you're going to harvest my kidneys. Like,
come record on our podcast, but really we want your kidneys.
Yeah, I really wasn't that worried about that. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, so like that idea of like the social network as already kind of having this web of trust and the friendship stuff, like that so far has been built over like centralized systems and databases, which is held by single entities.
I really like Keybase's approach to this, which is they build a web of trust, but like you go on, it's still centralized, but you go on to their platform and you look at a user, and then you can see this user has verified, like with a cryptographic signature, that this is my GitHub accounts, this is my Twitter accounts, this is my Bitcoin address, this is whatever. And you can add a bunch of different of these like identities to your accounts. And so I can go and check someone and say, like, this person hasn't verified anything anywhere. I think they're trying to scam me. Or like, this person has verified their GitHub and Twitter, and I know them there. So I know this is the same person. Yeah. And therefore I can like follow them and trust them on this platform as well. So you can merge that trust from other platforms onto Keybase.
Yeah.
But here what you're also describing is like then taking that the next step and saying like, well, the sort of ideas are there for like a truly kind of decentralized peer-to-peer thing, relying in a way on this. Is it relying on a web of trust? Not really.
Well, you just need to know that this identity is this. That this key is this identity. A web of trust is just one way of doing it. That is just kind of very close to what humans already do.
And that's why this sort of makes sense then. That's why you would then choose something like a social network where there needs to, or people are trusting each other and then create that thing underneath.
Yeah.
So you're kind of, so you're basically taking an idea. This is interesting because like it comes really from Web 2 and then you're like bringing it back to the more decentralized. direction.
Yeah, because the like user experience
Should be
on
the same.
using Twitter.com is decentralized.
Mhm.
Like you look at the thing and you only see the people that you've followed and the idiots that have retweeted and stuff like that. Not everyone doesn't see the same Twitter.com. They all see different ones. That it's centralized as an implementation detail. That causes a lot of problems. And I'm sure that when the way of implementing this in a peer-to-peer way is like all the details are really ironed out, then people will be like, why did even do it that way? Like, you have to have a whole data center and a big building in San Francisco and spend millions of dollars on like...
Then again, I mean, there have been attempts. What is it, Mastodon?
Yeah, but
And it's out there.
Mastodon is like federated.
Yeah, Mastodon only gets halfway there.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I think the problem of it isn't that it's federated. The problem is it's not adopted as much.
Yeah.
And there's some issues of like replication of identity. Do you know about this?
And that's like
Yeah.
your federation issue. So in a completely decentralized way, and you're controlling your own identity, I think there's less issues of that actually. But to your point, it's still about adoption and network effects. Twitter is popular because Twitter is popular. There's no other reason.
Yeah.
And, how do you win over network effects? And no one really knows. Like there's research that says that network effects suddenly die for no apparent reason.
Yeah.
So that's like what happened. Yeah.
Who remembers Friendster?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it doesn't really, it's not something we have to like solve all in one go, because it doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not just like one day everyone decided to use Facebook. It sort of built up from a smaller, started with a niche and slowly expanded. Like, you just have to find like who really, really wants this, and then who can it expand out, so it doesn't have to, like nothing goes 100% from zero.
I want to go back a little bit to, you mentioned a lot of problems with DHTs, and I want to dig into that a little bit. So on like peer discovery in particular, especially in this sort of untrusted setup, DHTs and peer discovery remain an issue. Like, DHTs are attackable.
Yep.
You can fill a DHT with garbage data and it becomes impossible to find valid nodes. It has a bunch of these problems. You know, the way that blockchains, like all blockchains that I know of, solve it is just have boot nodes. So basically, maybe we can start by explaining what boot nodes are, and then like, what are these problems? How do we work around them? Does SSB do anything around this that helps?
You just have a bootstrap node. You just have a list of nodes that are sort of built into the software that's like, when you want to start the network, you connect to one of these nodes. And
it will always be a real node.
Yeah.
This is basically like verified account.
Yeah.
Yeah. You could, like, if someone compromises those nodes, you could like reconfigure different nodes or something like this. It's just really to help things get started. It is a like mild point of centralization, but doesn't ruin the whole thing. And then they'll tell you about some other peers, and then you connect to those peers. And but the problems with DHTs, I think, stem from the fact that all of the members in the network, all of the peers in the network, interact in a very uniform way, and they don't have any way of deciding who not to interact with. They just have to execute the same protocol with anyone who connects to them. And that means they have no way of like avoiding malicious peers, or even identifying or telling if a peer is malicious. So that means someone wants to come in and scan the network and see who's holding what or something, they can easily do that. If someone wants to make a peer that is like this is called an Eclipse Attack. You generate a peer that looks like it. It might take a little bit of effort, but it ends up standing in front of the peer that's actually meant to be holding that content, and then you block that content or something. It's not like a hugely effective attack. It's just like an annoyance, sort of a denial of service sort of thing. But
once you get into blockchains, it can be a pretty significant attack. Yeah, because now suddenly you have one peer that's holding money or expecting to see some behavior, or if it's a mining node and you eclipse it, then their blocks aren't being propagated or whatever it may be. So you can actually cause some real damage.
Yeah, and blockchain made computer security really interesting, because now there's like an easy to reason about financial value on like everything. Now there's like a dollar value for like how much hashing power it takes to like reverse a password or something like that. Like, you can say that, well, if you could get these secondhand Bitcoin miners and use that to break passwords, then you can actually say exactly how much that costs. Attacks that, hacking into someone's machine or something, that would have been pointless. Like, you could have done it, but it would have been pointless. Now, if the answer is, you just steal their Bitcoin, it's like suddenly all of these hacks become monetizable. So it's created a whole new set of opportunities.
Auditing. But so just to go back to what you said, DHTs, you explained some of the issues around it, but do boot nodes fix for that? Or they're just sort of like, that's a reset button?
No, boot nodes just provide a way to get started in the network. To join the network, you normally need to know some other peer in the network and that they know you, perhaps. So a boot node is a way where it's just like, here's a fixed list of things. You could have another thing where it's like your friend invites you, or you have to, I don't know, go to something or something.
Depending on your use case, there may also be a fallback for if you find a DHT that's awfully polluted and you can't find a real node in it. You can fall back to the boot node and say, okay, I'm just going to sing from you and not talk to these other people. But then if your DHT is that polluted, you're running into a bunch of other problems.
Is there examples of DHTs that are still used today?
Oh, yeah, lots. Yeah.
Like?
Most
Bitcoin, Ethereum, and
oh, wow.
most other projects.
That would be considered a DHT.
But Torrent, I think the best, Ethereum has a DHT, but I don't really think it needs one. Like, most blockchains have a thing where there's one blockchain and everyone has a copy of it. So any full node is as good as any other. I think you could get by with just a gossip protocol. I know Ethereum has a DHT. Last I checked, Bitcoin didn't have one.
Oh, maybe it doesn't. I'm not sure. Ethereum for sure does.
Yeah,
and if
Ethereum
they're planning
does.
on doing other stuff with it, like, I want to get to this a little bit, but announcing, like, in the DHT, you can store data as well. And so they want to store like peer information in the DHT itself. So I speak this protocol, or I'm willing to serve like clients and other things like that.
Where does the DHT live in the kind of stack?
It's a very low level networking, like before you're really talking about blockchain stuff. And it's just in how you deal with peers.
So like under the EVM? No.
Yeah.
Okay. I can picture what it looks like. But it's nothing to do with like the block headers and the hashes around that, eh?
No.
Okay.
So each peer has a location in a ring. They connect to a couple of peers that are near them, a few more peers that are middle distance from them, and some more peers that are like a long way from them. So that if someone asks them, oh, do you know where this thing is? Then you can direct them to either like close or like at least moderately close, or like kind of like, and if they're like far away, you can say like go somewhere like way the hell over there, and then they can continue asking and eventually they find their place.
Cool.
So does SSB have a DHT, or what do you do?
SSB does not have a DHT. I always explicitly intended to avoid DHTs in SSB because of the aforementioned problems. And I felt like everyone sort of like puts the DHT into their protocol as like the hammer that solves every problem. And I wanted to prove that you can build a totally viable protocol without DHTs in it. So Scuttlebutt uses a different kind of structure to like organize the content and organize the peers and stuff like that. And that's just the human social network. And this is also like a globally connected graph where, well, pretty much close enough to globally connected. It has some interesting statistical properties where, like, some people have lots of friends or like celebrities, and so that branches like long distances. Like you have friends and friends of friends, and most of the people that you want to talk to are actually your friends of friends or your friends already. Like, when is the last time you met someone that wasn't a friend of a friend? Like, sometimes you meet people purely randomly, and that's like when you bump into them in person, that sort of stuff.
Or invite them to your podcast.
Yes, but this was actually a friend of a friend invitation, so that proves my point.
I don't think we've had any complete strangers on our podcast yet.
Yeah, sometimes you do bump into completely random people, but you also walk past hundreds of people every day on the street and you don't talk to them. When there's a completely random meeting, that's like a special, some kind of like cosmic destiny thing. Like that's not the typical case. So The typical case is like a friend of a friend.
So I'm curious. Yeah, that's interesting. So instead of having this kind of constructed network topology, the network topology in a sense is determined by your social graph. But that means this social graph would have to be public, right?
Yeah. So far, I have ideas about how to like hide this better, but so far, I mean, we're experimenting. We don't really now we've learned quite a bit, but we're trying a totally new thing. I could come on another podcast and talk about all the ways you could hide, you could make this more private. And I think a big way that history, technology, and stuff progresses is one person does a thing, and then someone later comes along and is like, "Well, that's stupid," and makes a way better version of that. So I'm hoping someone will come along and say that Scuttlebutt was stupid, and then make something much better. And that would be great because I won't have to maintain it.
Assuming it is public right now, it doesn't feel like you say, you never really talk to a stranger. So if you hid, like you just had your own social graph and kind of cut it at some arbitrary limits, and then to go beyond that limit, you need some sort of introduction.
Yes. Yeah, that'd be fine. Yeah.
Does SSP use boot nodes then? Do you have some sort of like early list that you start from?
Kind of. So we have a thing called a pub server, which it's the same code as an ordinary peer. It's pub as in short for public, but also pub as in like an English like public house, like a bar, where it's like a place you can go that is always the same place, and you can come like any time of the day, and your friends might be there. Pubs are basically like anyone can just run one, and it's exactly the same code as an ordinary peer. It just you run it on with a public address, so people can always connect to it, and anyone can run one of these pubs. And if they run a pub, they can give out invite codes, and then people can use those to come into the network. Basically, they're the bootstrap nodes, but we don't have an official list of them built into the protocol. It's like you have to go and get one from somewhere. You can be onboarded from another peer using the protocol or from one of these. So it's a little bit more democratized than just like built into the thing, but basically the same idea.
What does somebody do in a pub or at a pub or on a pub?
There's not really in or at. It's just like another peer. It just replicates messages. Okay. So when a pub follows you, they start replicating your messages and your friends' messages. And so if you connect to a pub that follows your friend, then you can get their messages from them. So that's how it works so far. We've got a new design that, because people were a bit confused by what the pubs did. And so the new idea is to change it so the pub is just represented as like another device that the human owns. So, I have a laptop and a cell phone. People are familiar with people to having both a laptop and a cell phone, but some people also have a server, and that's just another computer that they own or control.
And if you have a computer, if you have the server, then basically what would happen is you would just copy all of the stuff that you have and all of the friends and everybody who's touched base with you. Yeah. And that becomes then like but in this case, are you talking about data? Are you actually talking about like replication of data, or are you still talking about replication of peer addresses?
Replication of data.
Okay.
Because Scuttlebutt uses gossip, it doesn't actually need routing. As long as you connect to a mutual friend, my computer doesn't need to connect directly to you for you to get my messages, but you can get them from someone else. They could bump around like any number of mutual friends until.
And that's what you mean by data. Like it sits there. It's sort of you send some data and it sits on the friend, and then I can access it if I want to.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you've looked into Gossip Sub at all, the new sort of protocol.
From IPFS?
I think so. I mean, they're working on it, but I don't know if they actually like invented it. But basically, where instead of gossiping everything to everyone, someone can declare like, I want to hear gossip about this person, and then they only receive gossip about that.
I'm definitely in communication with the IPFS people, and we meet at conferences and things like that and discuss protocol designs. We've been trying to influence the direction of Gossip Sub, and there's some elements that I figured out in Secure Scuttlebutt that were sort of using similar things. There's this thing called Plum Tree that has influenced both of us. The main difference we have so far is that Scuttlebutt uses logs. So with IPFS, you broadcast like the latest thing, and if you're not online when something is broadcast, you might not get it if you come back on. And with Scuttlebutt, if something is, it's just appended. So if you come back online after being offline, you get everything that was sent. So Scuttlebutt doesn't work very well for things that are like only the latest thing matters, like you always get the history.
Yeah.
But it works really well for that.
Interesting.
I guess the way you just described this and the social graph and sharing this message, like there's nothing private in your system then, is there?
No, that's not correct.
Okay. So
there is. So
correct me.
The basic thing is you have this log of messages that you've created. And by default, the messages are public, kind of like on Twitter. But also like on Twitter, you have a private message as well. And a private message is just a public message, except it's encrypted. So it's encrypted, and then only the recipients can read it.
If they have the key.
If they have the key. And the neat thing about it is that everyone who sees it tries to decrypt it, and only the people that it's for will successfully decrypt it. And because everyone tries to decrypt it, it means that no one can actually know who it's really for.
Except for the person.
Yeah, exactly. So think of it like, instead of sending like a letter, like if you post a letter to your friend only your friend will read the letter, but the post office will know who you send that letter to. In Scuttlebutt, it's more like you put a note on your door, you just hammer it to your front door, and everyone can come by and see that you've written a note, but only the person that it's actually for can read the note. So no one actually knows who it's for, except for the person who receives it. So it protects the metadata. And I think that's really important nowadays. It's actually more important to protect the metadata than to protect the content, because the content is quite hard to analyze automatically, but the metadata is really easy. So if you know who someone is talking to, you can be like, well, these people are influencing each other. So if this one is trouble, these people, we should watch them as well. But if you could see the content of what people are saying, like it's hard to say if, just from particular words in the content, whether or not that is sarcasm or a joke or whatever. Like you actually need like a human who understands the context to look at that. Yeah, computers still can't do that very well.
I like that. I like that idea. I have, for some reason, as you were describing it, like putting some message in a public place physically, and then having someone who has like special, I don't know, psychedelic glasses that can actually read it, because they have the key, the special glasses, and actually everyone else can walk right by it and have no idea. Like they can look at it, but they'll have no idea what's in it. And they don't know who it's for. Even though there's this one person with these really weird glasses, like getting really excited about the note. Cool. So often there's a term pub sub that comes up. Is that related to anything that we've already talked about?
We talked a little bit about gossip sub, which is sort of the decentralized equivalent in some way. Pub sub assumes that you have publishers and subscribers, right? And that's what it sort of stands for. And that's true in a decentralized setting as well. But for the publishers to be able to reach the subscribers directly, you need to solve the routing problem. You need to route directly, and they need to have direct, or even if not direct connections, then some routed connections to each other, so that I can say I'm going to publish this message for these subscribers. And you can have one-to-one or many-to-many or one-to-many channels and all these kinds of things. But you run into all of these other problems if you want to have a pub sub system. So I think the more interesting thing in what blockchains like Polkadot and Ethereum 2 and all these other systems that have multiple actors, they are now looking into how can we modify our gossip protocols so that we're not gossiping transactions and blocks to everyone, because it's not relevant to everyone anymore. I just want to gossip these blocks or transactions to this particular shard because that's the only one they're relevant for. But they still want to use gossip because they don't know who the validators or who the full nodes are for this shard. So they want to just gossip everything out, but they want to be able to say only these people get it, otherwise you overload the whole network.
In a way, can you then use that for defining roles? Like if you have different entities with different roles, they would have special keys that would allow them to see the secret messages in a pool of gossip?
Yeah, that's the idea. But there's another crux of that matter, and that is how you do peer discovery in a topic-based way. So we were mentioned briefly, like in Ethereum 1, we're talking about adding data to the DHT to say, like, I am willing to serve light clients. But ideally, I am able to find someone who serves light clients without having to go through this DHT because it has problems. But that's, as far as I know, an unsolved problem.
I just remembered one of the other problems with DHTs. To find a thing, you may have to connect to a lot of a logarithmic number of nodes, which can take a while if you have a bad connection. Lookups can be quite slow.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think actually in the blockchain world, we're actually a little bit spoiled by this. And we're kind of saved by the fact that blockchains aren't popular and aren't used by anyone. Because there's so few nodes that we can pretty easily find the whole network and look through all the nodes in a reasonable amount of time. But if you look at like BitTorrent that has probably millions of entries in its DHT, it's a completely different story.
Yeah. Well, you probably barely need a DHT in that case.
Probably not.
Yeah.
So we've covered a couple of the challenges of sort of decentralized networking, but like with what's been created now, and specifically what you've been working on, what's still a challenge there?
I think it's a matter of like layers. Like once you have solved the identity mapping problem, then things like messaging becomes much more simple. It's just in the things that were the obvious next steps in a centralized web were different to what is actually the simplest to build of most obvious things in a decentralized web. So, first in the traditional web, you had like websites, then you had like GeoCities, and then it took quite a while before people discovered sort of blogs and then social networks. But I think in decentralized world, it's actually easier to go back the other way. So a social peer-to-peer thing was actually like, so this is actually the best starting point, and then we can use that to get to these other things. You'll probably go other places.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to us about decentralized networking and what you've been working on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
And to our listeners, thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.